All her life, Natalie Wood was afraid of dark water. It was said a warning had followed her since childhood, that she should fear the sea, that one day it would take her. At 43, after a night of wine and raised voices aboard her own yacht, she was found floating in the Black Pacific off Catalina Island, dressed for bed, wrapped in a red coat, a mile from the deck she had stepped from. The death was ruled an accident. Decades later, it was reopened, the verdict unsettled, and never truly answered. That was the contradiction of Natalie Wood. She had the face of innocence, the discipline of a veteran, the fame of a woman who had survived Hollywood twice over. And yet her ending belonged not to the bright rooms of cinema, but to black water near Catalina Island, where beauty, marriage, panic, and silence met in the dark. Everyone knew the child from Miracle on 34th Street. Everyone knew the wounded girl beside James Dean, the Maria of West Side Story, the young woman trembling with feeling in Splendor in the Grass. She wore Hollywood's borrowed crown before she was old enough to understand the bargain. By the time she died at 43, the world had lost more than a star. It had lost a woman still trying to separate the person from the image, the mother from the myth, the living soul from the photograph. This is the story of Natalie Wood, the little girl given a scepter before she could hold it, and the woman whose final night refused to sink. Before her story begins, a word for those of you who remember her, and who remember all of them. If these are the faces you grew up with, the names that once filled your theaters and your evenings, then you are among friends here. Subscribe to The Fallen Scepter and stay close to us. These are the lives we have gathered to remember, one by one. July 20th, 1938, San Francisco. A city of fog, steep streets, and windows silvered by Pacific air. She was born Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko, daughter of Russian immigrant parents, Nikolai and Maria. The name itself carried distance. It had crossed borders before it reached California. It belonged to a family marked by exile, hope, reinvention, and that old immigrant knowledge that America could remake a life if one paid dearly enough. Her family later used the name Gurdin. Then Hollywood gave her another name altogether, Natalie Wood. It was simpler, smoother, easier for a studio to place on a poster. And in that small act of renaming, something of the future appeared. The child would be loved by millions, but always partly translated for them. She was raised partly in Santa Rosa, where the world must still have seemed small enough to hold. Her mother, Maria, encouraged performance early. Ballet, discipline, the little rituals of presentation. There was ambition in that house, and perhaps fear as well. A mother who had come from uncertainty could look at a child and see not only a daughter, but rescue. Natalie's face drew attention. Her emotions seemed near the surface. She could appear still and yet full of feeling, like a candle behind thin paper. Maria introduced her to the director Irving Pichel, and the door opened. In 1943, still a very small child, Natalie appeared in Happyland, filmed around Santa Rosa. In 1946 came her first credited role in Tomorrow is Forever. She had not yet had the ordinary luxury of being invisible. The camera had found her early, and once it did not easily let go. By 1947, she was Susan Walker in Miracle on 34th Street, the solemn little girl who had to learn belief. Audiences saw charm, composure, and intelligence beyond her years. They saw a child who seemed natural on screen. What they could not see was the labor beneath it, the auditions, the waiting, the instruction, the demand to cry when asked and be still when told. Child actors are often praised for seeming untouched by artifice. That is the first cruelty. The child is working precisely because she has learned artifice before she has learned herself. It was said that Natalie could summon tears on command. Such a gift sounds magical until one thinks of the lesson underneath it. Feeling had become useful. Feeling had become professional. Feeling in the proper light could help support a family. There was another thread in childhood, darker and stranger. A warning had settled around her family that she would die by drowning. Whether superstition, fear, or story, it clung. Then, at 10, while filming The Green Promise, a bridge rigged to collapse sent her into water and she broke her wrist. The old fear found a body. The body remembered. She was a child. She was working. She was afraid of deep water. And a throne was already being built for her, plank by plank, in rooms where adults made promises. Then Hollywood decided she was ready to become more than a child. The 1950s arrived with their polished cars, their tight smiles, their bright young rebels pretending not to be frightened. Natalie had survived the first danger of child stardom, growing older in public. Many did not. The children who filled screens were often set aside once their faces changed. Hollywood loved innocence, but it loved freshness more. Natalie, however, had something that could not be put away with the toys. She had intensity. She had the rare ability to look as though a secret had just passed through her and left its mark. In 1955, at 17, she played Judy in Rebel Without a Cause, opposite James Dean and Sal Mineo. The film carried the ache of a generation that could not explain itself. Natalie did not merely stand beside Dean's legend, she held her ground. Her Judy was tender, lost, proud, and exposed. She gave the part a tremor that felt lived rather than performed. The role brought her an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actress. She was no longer merely the child from the Christmas film. She had stepped into another chamber of fame, where youth was worshipped and sorrow photographed beautifully. Then James Dean died, killed in a car crash that September, only weeks before the film opened in cinemas. The loss cast a long sadness over that moment. For Natalie, triumph did not arrive cleanly. It came with mourning beside it, as though the bright rooms had already begun to dim at the edges. In 1956, she appeared in John Ford's The Searchers, another important step in the passage from childhood roles into adult work. In 1957, she won a Golden Globe as New Star of the Year. That same year, on December 28th, she married Robert Wagner. They were young, handsome, famous, and almost too perfectly arranged for public affection. He was the polished leading man. She was the girl who had grown up before the nation's eyes. Together, they looked like a studio still of happiness, the kind of photograph that lets strangers invent certainty. And for a while, the ascent continued. In 1958 came Marjorie Morningstar, strengthening her adult leading lady career. Then, 1961 brought two roles that fixed her in cultural memory. In Splendour in the Grass, she played Deanie, a young woman strained by love, repression, and collapse. It earned her a Best Actress nomination. In West Side Story, she became Maria, the romantic heart of one of cinema's defining musicals, even though much of Maria's singing voice was dubbed by Marni Nixon. The contradiction was exquisite. Her voice had been replaced, but her presence could not be. The camera did not love her because she sang. It loved her because she seemed to feel too much for the frame to contain. In 1962 came Gypsy. In 1963, Love with the Proper Stranger brought another Best Actress nomination. She was in her 20s and already a veteran, already someone who had worked for most of her life. She had taken up the scepter of adult stardom, and the world had agreed she could keep it. And yet, behind the applause, there were rooms where the smile faded before the door was closed. She was 23. She was famous. She had no ordinary childhood to return to. The first crack did not arrive in a headline large enough to explain it. These things seldom do. It lived in the strain between public perfection and private weather. Natalie's marriage to Robert Wagner had been sold to the world as glamour made domestic. Two beautiful actors, two rising careers, the kind of couple people wanted to believe in because it made fame look less lonely. But a marriage built beneath flashbulbs still had to survive in ordinary rooms. There were gowns and interviews and the gracious posture of a woman trained never to look as wounded as she felt. We have all known someone like this, the one who smiled through what was breaking, who learned that appearing composed could become its own kind of prison. She did not stop working. She could not. Work had been the steady fact of her life since childhood. But she wanted more than to be looked at. She wanted to be taken seriously as an actress, and she pursued the private labor of finding a self beneath the constructed one: therapy, journaling, self-examination. There was discipline in that, and courage too. Yet the town was changing around her. The old studio system, with its machinery of control and protection, was fading, and the industry that had once shaped its girl no longer seemed certain what to do with the woman she had become. Beauty in that place was praised as if it were power and treated as if it had an expiry date. A divorce can look small beside death. People marry, people part. The law signs its paper, and the world moves on. But for Natalie Wood, the end of that first marriage broke more than a private hope. It broke the polished story that had been built around her. The child star had become the teenage icon. The icon had become the leading lady. The leading lady had married the handsome actor, and the public had arranged them all into a neat little kingdom of beauty. By 1962, the kingdom had failed. The separation came first, then the quiet, administrative language of divorce. And that, not a scream, not the sea but a signature on a page, was the moment the scepter slipped. The girl who had been renamed by Hollywood, shaped by Hollywood, and paired by Hollywood's imagination, stood once more without the picture that had framed her. There had been ambition, but also dependence. There had been fame, but also the particular loneliness of being watched without being known. Natalie could be surrounded by people and still seem to stand slightly apart, listening for a note no one else could hear. And yet she did not vanish. In 1969, she married the British producer Richard Gregson. Another room entered with hope, another life attempted beyond the old frame. In 1970, her daughter Natasha was born, and motherhood offered a love no studio had arranged, not dependent on lighting, not measured at the box office. A child looked at her and did not see Natalie Wood the star. A child saw mother. But the old patterns had not loosened their hold. The marriage to Gregson ended in divorce in 1972. And that same year, on the 16th of July, Natalie married Robert Wagner a second time. There was poetry in the return, and danger in it too. Sometimes people go back because love remains. Sometimes because the past is the only country whose roads they still know by heart. From the outside, the years ahead would look softer. Family, home, motherhood, work chosen rather than chased. But beneath the floorboards of that gentler life, old water was already gathering. The second marriage to Robert Wagner was quieter than the first. It had fewer of the glittering young illusions and more of the weary knowledge adults carry when they have already lost what they once thought permanent. Both had lived, both had failed, both had returned. Natalie brought Natasha from her marriage to Richard Gregson. With Wagner, she had another daughter, Courtney, born March 9, 1974. She also became stepmother to Katie Wagner. The household gave her something Hollywood had never quite offered, a role that did not require applause. Motherhood mattered deeply to her. She wanted to protect her daughters from the machinery that had shaped her own childhood. It is a small sentence, that one, but there is a whole life folded inside it. Natalie knew what it meant to be useful too young. She knew what it meant to earn before one understood money, to perform before one understood privacy, to be praised for obedience and feeling in equal measure. She worked more selectively. The actress remained, but she was no longer a child being pulled through the system by adult hands. In the late 1970s, she turned more toward television, including From Here to Eternity, for which she later won a Golden Globe. She had not disappeared, she had adapted. And yet the public world was less forgiving to women who grew older in front of it. The same industry that had celebrated her face as a child, then as a teenager, then as a young woman, did not always know how to honor continuity. It preferred revelation to endurance. Natalie had endured, and endurance is not always glamorous. We watch such lives and something stirs in us. Pity, perhaps, or recognition. The quiet knowledge that even the gilded rooms had drafts under the doors. There were still parties, still friends, still the household in Brentwood, still scripts and cameras. There were also whispers around career, marriage, jealousy, and image. Fame had a way of entering a room before the person did. It sat at the table. It listened at doors. It turned private gestures into public weather. The fear of water remained. It had not been ornamental. It had not been a pretty symbol laid onto her life after the fact. It had been part of her, tied to the old warning and to the childhood accident that had left her injured and terrified. Dark water frightened her. Deep water frightened her. The sea was not romance to her in the simple way it is to holiday photographs. It was beauty with a threat inside it. Still, she spent time aboard the family yacht, the Splendor. Love does that sometimes. So does habit. So does the wish to be normal, to refuse fear its full authority. The yacht represented escape and status and leisure, but for Natalie, it also carried the older dread. By 1981, she was working again with serious intent. The science fiction film Brainstorm placed her opposite Christopher Walken. It was not merely another job. It was a return to the center of the frame, proof that she could still command attention, not as memory, but as a living artist. Walken was gifted, private, and intense, and he and Natalie worked closely on the film. Robert Wagner was there too, husband for the second time, partner in a story that had already broken once and been repaired. It is the part of these stories we want least to hear, that repair is not the same as peace. A broken cup may hold water again, but the line remains. Thanksgiving approached. There would be a weekend at Catalina. Natalie, Wagner, Walken, and Captain Dennis Davern would board the Splendor. The sea waited, patient as old grief. And this time, the fear she had carried since childhood would not stay on shore. November 27, 1981, Marina del Rey. Around noon, the Splendor left for Catalina Island with Natalie Wood, Robert Wagner, Christopher Walken, and Dennis Davern aboard. There was no sign, not one that the world could read, that this would become one of Hollywood's enduring mysteries. The plan was ordinary enough. A holiday weekend, a yacht, dinner ashore, famous people trying to behave as though the sea gave them privacy. Natalie was 43. She was working on Brainstorm. She was mother to Natasha and Courtney. She was still, after all those years, reaching toward the next version of herself. The weekend darkened quickly. Alcohol flowed. Tension rose. On Friday night, the strain between husband and wife became severe enough that Davern grew concerned. It was said that he took Natalie ashore in the inflatable dinghy, the Prince Valiant, and that they spent the night at the Pavilion Lodge Hotel in Avalon. The next morning, they returned to the yacht. Saturday brought more drinking and more unease. Natalie and Walken went ashore to Doug's Harbour Reef. Wagner and Davern later joined them. The group consumed wine, champagne, and other drinks. Natalie ate little and seemed unhappy. By around 10 that night, they had returned to the yacht. After that, the story became a chamber of competing voices. A witness heard Natalie scream as she boarded but thought little of it. Later, there were raised voices. There was broken glass in the salon. Wagner would eventually acknowledge that he had broken a wine bottle. Walken withdrew. Somewhere in the night, Natalie was no longer aboard. Wagner maintained that he and Walken had been speaking without anger, that Natalie left the conversation, and that he later went to say goodnight and found her missing. Davern later claimed the night had been far more volatile, that searchlights were not used at once, and that the response did not match the danger. At 1:30 in the morning, Wagner and Davern made a distress call to the Coast Guard. Hours had passed. The night had done its work. Morning came without mercy. Around 7:30 or 8 o'clock, Natalie Wood was found in the Pacific near Blue Cavern Point, roughly a mile from the yacht and about 200 yards offshore. She wore a flannel nightgown, blue wool socks, and a red down jacket. The Prince Valiant was found washed against rocks nearby. Its ignition was off. The gear shift was in neutral. The oars were locked. Her blood alcohol level was at least 0.14. There were bruises on her arms and legs, a cut on her cheek, and other marks that would trouble the story for years. The first ruling was accidental drowning. One theory held that she had tried to secure or board the dinghy, fallen into the water, and been overcome by cold, exhaustion, and the weight of the soaked jacket. But doubt did not drown with her. A woman known to fear deep water had ended up alone in it, at night, dressed for bed. Nearby witnesses later spoke of cries for help around midnight. The timing, the bruises, the delay, the dinghy, the broken glass. Each piece seemed to float separately, never joining into a shape the world could accept. Natalie Wood died on November 29, 1981. She was 43 years old. There was no long decline, no old age, no final season of gentle withdrawal. There was only a working actress, a mother of young daughters, a woman still becoming, and then the sea. The scepter was not laid down. It was broken in the dark. After Natalie's death, the public mourned the star and argued over the night. Her final film, Brainstorm, was released after her death and dedicated to her. In 1987, she received a posthumous star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame. The ceremonies came, as ceremonies do, with polished words and fixed smiles. But the case did not sleep. In 2011, authorities reopened the investigation. In 2012, the death certificate was amended from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors. The change did not declare murder. It did not give the world a clean answer. It merely allowed the official language to admit what had long been felt. The old explanation did not hold all the weight. In 2018, investigators described the death as suspicious and named Robert Wagner a person of interest, while saying no charges had been filed and that it was not a murder investigation. Later reporting noted that investigators had been unable to prove whether the death was an accident or something else, that no charges were ever filed, and that the case remained open and unsolved. There it stayed. Open, unsolved. A door left ajar in a house no one wished to enter after dark, and yet Natalie Wood was more than the water that took her. She was not merely a mystery in a red jacket. She was the child who held a Christmas film steady, the teenager who stood beside James Dean and did not vanish, the young woman who made pain visible in splendor in the grass, the Maria whose face carried the feeling even when another voice carried the song, the actress who moved from child star to adult force, from film to television, from studio invention to self-examination. Fellow travelers, perhaps that is why her story still unsettles us. Not only because the final facts resisted capture, but because so much of her life had already been a struggle to be seen clearly. First by her mother, then by studios, then by husbands, then by audiences, then by history. Her estate was described in the millions, and later summaries placed it around $2.5 million in 1981. There were provisions for family, trusts, heirs, the tidy paperwork that follows even the untidiest death. Paper can divide property, it cannot divide absence. What remained were films, daughters, photographs, arguments, and a question moving like tide water beneath everything. The opening image stayed, a child teaching belief, a woman found in the sea. Between them lay a life of talent, discipline, beauty, fear, and unfinished becoming. And somewhere beyond the harbour lights, the fallen sceptre rested beside an empty throne in a palace gone quiet at last. If you found yourself in this story, even for a moment, you may find yourself in the next one too. Subscribe to The Fallen Sceptre and stay with us. There are many more lives to remember.